first. After months of political ping-ponging and several aborted attempts by peers to dilute the legislation, the controversial illegal migration bill was passed late last night. So anyone who arrives in the UK via illegal routes will now face deportation either to their country of origin or a safe third country. The bill's central to the Prime Minister's pledge to stop the boats. But opponents say it's littered with human rights issues and it will break international law. Protesters were demonstrating in Westminster yesterday to try and block the bill. Well, that included the comedian Dom Jolly, who was dressed as Mickey Mouse. Now, his outfit choice was clearly a nod to the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick's decision to paint over the Disney cartoon murals at a children's asylum processing centre. That was a move that even Nigel Farage branded as mean. Well, another part of the plan is to cut the £6 million daily cost of accommodating migrants by housing them not in hotels, but in huge barges. Today, the Bibby Stockholm barge, with a capacity to accommodate 500 asylum seekers, was tugged into Portland Port and met by protesters on arrival. That will provide temporary accommodation for hundreds of male migrants by the end of the month. Well, joining me to discuss all of these developments is the immigration lawyer, Harjap Singh Bhangal. Thank you so much for your time this evening. We've got two developments, really, in the last 24 hours. First is the illegal migration bill going for royal assent, finally, and the other is the development of these barges. Let's start with the barges, why don't we? From your perspective, is this the government genuinely looking at the policy, or is it about optics to say to the public, OK, we're not going to put these people in hotels anymore, we'll put them somewhere that looks a bit more miserable?
Well, if we look at the cost of these barges, because I've been doing a bit of digging around, as have others, this is a space for 2,000 people. The barges have been arranged. The contract has been given to an Australian company for 2 years at a cost of 1.6 billion. That's 800,000 per person for over 2 years. So I think the cost is not really much more or less than the hotels, if not even more. And it's only 2,000 spaces. Now, we've already paid X amount to Rwanda, I think millions to Rwanda, 140 million, is it? And for 500 spaces. So it does seem like it's optics. And if we look at the fact that 450 migrants arrived today and similar numbers over the weekend, probably more, then the barges will be full in about 3 days and Rwanda will be full in 1 day. So what are we going to do next week with next week's migrants that come over? So it does seem as if the government is trying to do optics. And as always, I say, it's best to follow the money to find out who's making money out of these contracts and whether they have any links to governments, because these prices and these rates are costing the British taxpayer, especially when the government are saying we don't have money for nurses, doctors, railway workers, teachers, even our armed services. But they seem to find money for these contractors.
Are the barges an appropriate solution? Because I mentioned that it was met with protests, and it was a combination of things. Some people were saying, look, you add 500 more people here. We haven't actually got capacity here already for dentists, doctors, healthcare, education. But other people were saying, quite simply, it is inhumane to put people on barges.
Well, I think it's a bit of both, to be fair. I mean, if you're going to park a barge outside someone's village, then you've got to have the consensus of the village. And if the residents aren't having it, then there needs to be a consultation on this issue and it needs to be approved. And once again, the whole purpose of these barges, is it optics or is this really going to stop people traffickers? I always say you don't stop drug dealing by locking up the drug users. You won't stop people trafficking by locking up the people that are being trafficked.
I mean, they do need to put people somewhere, and clearly the hotels has been such a divisive option. It's one piece, and the government have always said, look, there's going to have to be lots of different strategies if they're going to get a handle on this. What for them looks at least like a success is the final going to royal assent, the bill, the illegal migration bill. Do you actually think in practice the bill is going to have the impact that the Prime Minister wants in terms of stopping the boats?
I think what's more essential than stopping the boats is to improve the removal rate of people who have had their claims refused. Now, that alarmingly, under this government, has gone down from 60,000 in 2009. We were sending back 60,000 people a year. And that now, last year, the enforced removals has gone down to 3,000. So 50,000 people coming a year is a problem if you're only sending back 3,000 a year. If you're 50,000 people coming back a year, it's not a problem if you're sending 60,000 back. And there's no provision in that to speed up removals or invest that point. We could have invested the 1.6 million in speeding up claims. It shouldn't take 2 years to make a decision on asylum claims when that can be done in 15 days. So I think the investment has got to be right, the system's got to be right, and there needs to be a combination of everything. Maybe a processing centre in France, which France have already offered to do. But more importantly, Rishi Sunak said this is this country who should decide who should come into our country, into our countries. The government should decide, and not the gangs. Well, go and get the gangs then. Go and get them. Why can't you catch a number of gangs who are using the same routes for the past 20 years
Harjap,
to send people over?
The solutions you're putting forward actually aren't reflected in the policy. We've just seen change in the sort of the last 24 hours or so. Thank you very much for your time. Harjap Singh Bhangal, immigration lawyer, talking us through the latest developments. Well, I've got a panel itching to get stuck into this. Joining me is campaigner and journalist Mike Buckley, apprentice star and commentator Joanna Jarjue, and Conservative commentator Benedict Spence. Thank you all very much for being here. Benedict, let's start with you. On paper, the Conservatives have had a bit of a victory. The bill's now going for royal assent, but is it going to have an impact on the number of people arriving who then need to be processed before they're sent to then their third country?
I mean, in the short term, no. One would imagine it's not going to have that big of a hit. Whether it does long term, because people see the prospect of them having to stay in barges or being deported to Rwanda and think again about whether or not they want to come, remains to be seen. But I would imagine that it won't have the largest impact. It might have a bit of a dent, but it's not going to have that sort of immediate hit that the government might be hoping for. And that, I think, is really where the issue will come. I think, the government will turn around to the public and say, look, we've managed to get this bill through the House of Commons, the House of Lords. It's now law. We are doing something. And the members of the public will turn around and go, well, OK, but you're the government. That's kind of what we expect you to be able to do. And we all know that the House of Lords isn't really that powerful in the grand scheme of things. It can only do a few things to change the nature of the bill. What are the actual impacts of this bill going to be? And I think until you see a reduction in the numbers of people coming, or an increase in the number of people being deported or moved overseas whilst they have their claims heard, until you see that, I don't think that the public is going to really buy this as some sort of great victory. They will see the government passing legislation as the government's role. What they want to see is an actual change.
Legislation.
They want effective legislation, and that's the thing. We don't necessarily know whether or not this is going to be particularly effective, because there are still going to be all kinds of legal challenges to whether or not people can be sent to Rwanda. We haven't actually got over that, hurdle yet. We don't know how effective the barges are going to be at keeping people, whether or not they're going to be safe, whether or not there are going to be protestations, whether or not there might be other issues around that. Local communities aren't particularly happy about them anyway, and this is, I'm afraid,
that very clear.
They've made this very clear, and that's the thing. We're at an early stage, and it might seem like the government is sort of breathing a sigh of relief and going, thank heavens we've got this through. But the public are going, OK, but there are hundreds of thousands of people in the country. What are you going to do about them?
Yeah, Mike, do you think this is going to work? Or is it, as the Prime Minister has made quite clear, look, it's going to have to be one part of a multifaceted solution here?
I mean, there's no way this is going to do what the government is saying it's going to do. It's not going to stop the boats. The boats exist because of this government, because of the botched Brexit deal that they put together. They're continuing because this is about the only way that these people can get to the UK, because the government's refused to establish safe and legal routes. This won't put people off coming. People will still come, and the government will continue housing them.
They need to contest the fact that they haven't put in safe and legal routes in some cases. For example, Hong Kong, Ukraine, Afghanistan. There are options. Those options aren't available to everybody.
Only if you come from those countries.
Yeah.
And indeed, I think some of those options have now been switched off, for Ukraine, for example. What we're looking at is a massive government failure. As the previous guest said...
Define the failure.
Well, as the previous guest said, we used to, in 2009, we returned 60,000 people a year to their countries of origin, or a third safe country. We're now returning 3,000 a year. That's entirely the responsibility of this government. When Labour left power, we were processing asylum cases very, very quickly. It's now taking up to 2 years to process a claim. That's why we've got this huge backlog. That's why people are in hotels. That's why people are going to be on barges at a cost of $6 billion a day. to the taxpayer.
So do you actually think this is an admin issue?
It is an admin issue. The government have created this problem by refusing to process asylum claims. Germany do it in a month. It takes us 2 years. There's one reason for that. Our government has failed to do it. I don't think it's even incompetence. I think they've chosen to do that. They've wanted to manufacture this problem so they can say to the public, look, there's a problem. But as Benedict said, the public are looking at this and saying, you're the government, fix the problem.
Joanna, do you think that's fair? They've engineered this crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, I say this, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but this is the only thing that they've got. They're clutching at straws at the moment. They can't run on any other policy. In terms of success, even things like the pandemic, they always bang on about, oh, we were so fast with the vaccine rollout, etc. But then you look at Partygate, and whenever there is a government actual success, there's always their own failure that comes back to them. And with this, I just think it's another thing that they're using. So the barges, before they were considering putting these people on army bases, but then you had certain Conservative MPs that were having a kind of NIMBYism type of mindset and didn't want that. So now the easiest thing is barges. But it's not actually that these barges are going to be instead of the hotels. It's basically just to cover an overflow. So what they're going to do, once they've filled up the barges, is they're going to be another thing that they're going to have us pay for. And I think that's the key thing here. People forget that it's us that's footing the bill. And if you were to do a full assessment of, you know, what works and what doesn't work, realistically, would it have been better to invest in a massive recruitment drive for the Home Office to make sure, like Mike said, that people are processed quickly and that we do things like utilise the returns agreement that we've got with Albania, rather than using this just for optics to say, hey, look, the migrants are kind of swarming us?
But, you know, the Labour Party haven't come out and said, you know, if we win the election, we'll close those barges. They don't seem to have. We're all talking about what potential solutions could be here. Yeah. They don't seem to have a really clear vision of how they'd fix it.
Well,
I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, the Labour Party...
Tell me what you think it is, Mike.
Well, Yvette Cooper said, yes, she did a speech on this yesterday. She said, of course, they will inherit a situation in which the barges are necessary to house people, but she then said very clearly they would start processing claims more quickly. As Joanna just said, recruiting people to work in the Home Office to process these claims, after which we won't need the barges and we won't need the hotels. People who deserve to have their asylum in this country, their claims should be processed, they should then be able to integrate into society, get a job, contribute, as indeed that's why they came here, that's what they want to do, you know, as well as escaping where they came from. People who shouldn't be refugees here, they should either return to their home country or a safe third country.
This is part of the problem. This is where I'm going to sound even more cynical than these two. That is the idea that if we were to invest in the processing, we could speed up the process of getting people back to where they came from if they don't deserve to be here or we don't want them here. That is where I'm cynical. I don't think the government actually wants to send many of these people back at all, because this government, as this has shown throughout its tenure, is very pro-mass migration in all forms, because it needs those people to prop up an ailing economy. So we can sit here and we can talk about how the money would be better spent employing people to work in the Home Office, to work through these backlogs. But actually, you're just going to get more people having their asylum processes applications rubber stamped, and then they have nowhere to live because we aren't building enough houses, we aren't building enough shelters in this country.